think this presentation is particularly important because over the course of our time together for the next hour, we really want to talk about the role of philanthropy as it relates to racial equity. So I have a few questions I'll be asking our esteemed colleague for their comments and points of view. So first and foremost, many of us have seen this huge influx of philanthropic dollars moved to Black-led organizations in the wake of the George Floyd murder. However, 2 years later, what has been the impact of those investments for Black-led organizations in particular, as well for the nonprofit sector? In addition to the influx of philanthropic dollars, what other actions did you notice occurred that moved to Black-led organizations? So I'll have any of the panelists maybe start us off.
I'm happy to start. So AFI is an organization that supports philanthropy and investing in Black communities. So I'll be really explicit in our focus on calling out Blackness as a part of our efforts. So what we've noticed, one, is to call out that there's a $20 million funding equity gap in what our Black-led organizations receive from foundations and white-led organizations. So I think it's important to start there. I also know that the murder of George Floyd sparked sort of crisis funding. And we know that crisis funding is not a sustainable way to invest in anything, much less in racial injustice and racial equity. We have seen philanthropy step up in many ways, from corporate philanthropy wanting to invest, I think, upwards of $50 million that they publicly committed to. We know much of that money has not hit our communities in the ways that were initially designed. But we also know that we have foundations who have made tremendous efforts in behaving their racial equity journeys and strategies and how that work is. There's also a publication called Mismatched that was done by the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Justice. The organization is called FREE. And what it really talks about is how the influx of philanthropy and the funds that went towards quote-unquote racial justice and racial equity work, many of these foundations gave the same amount of money to the same organizations. They just may have called it a racial justice organization. So if they gave to a food bank, it was then considered a racial equity investment. So we understand that there are gaps in how philanthropy has responded and continues to respond to racial equity and the calls for racial justice. But I'm encouraged in how our panelists and others will continue to really strive for investments that are radical and transformative to Black communities.
I'm from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. For those of you who don't know, RWJF is the nation's largest philanthropy dedicated solely to health and improving health for all who live in this country. It is our vision that we work alongside our partners to create what we call a culture of health, where everyone has a fair and just opportunity to achieve health and well-being. I think the confluence of both the murder of George Floyd, which awakened this racial reckoning in this country, combined with the very clear disparities we were seeing as a result of COVID-19, made us take a hard look at the way we were doing our philanthropic practices and being much more explicit of the role that structural racism plays as a social determinant of health. How structural racism infiltrates many of the systems of health and healthcare, producing the disparities that we're seeing in terms of people of color versus those who are not of color. Based on the conversations you asked, like what's the impact been over the last 2 years, the conversations we've had with many of our Black-led organizations is that they're feeling more seen because traditionally philanthropies have not invested, to Tahira's point, in groups and organizations that were led by people of color. Some of that is by design and some of it is unintentional in the ways that we have our requirements requirements for grant making, our requirements for reporting that make it really unsustainable or inaccessible for many Black-led organizations to even apply for funding, much less to meet the criteria of grants. So we found that many of our field partners are saying, yes, thank you, finally we've been seeing, but we're still not being fully valued in the work that we're doing across the country and in communities. We've found that we at RWJF have particularly invested in federal advocacy in the lead up of the new administration, and we prioritize Black-led organizations in that work, particularly Black-led organizations who could bridge across health, economic, and social justice. And when we funded them flexibly. So we gave them general operating support and let them use that in whatever ways that they thought worked best for their organization. We also reduced the reporting requirements that we had traditionally associated with our grants for our general operating support, allowing them much more flexibility and less onerous requirements when it came to reporting. We also found that, to Tahira's point, that we were able to do this because our endowment was also growing during this period of time. But when you look at the amount of dollars that Black-led organizations were getting versus white-led organizations were also seeing a huge growth in their own fundraising and money that was coming in. So I just want to call out that the disparities that Tahira mentioned are still very much present even in this period of time when everybody has this acute focus on racial equity. And I think finally for RWJF, from our perspective, we still have a long way to go to look at all of our investments and see where they play in terms of the scale between race neutrality, racial equity, and racial justice. We have a long way to go. Our investments traditionally and our longstanding investments very much do lean towards the race neutrality end of the spectrum. And there's a lot more that we can do to start pushing us closer and closer to racial justice. So I'll stop there.
Hi, Leslie Boissiere with the AEKC Foundation, and I wish we had a laser focus on health equity. We have a focus on brighter futures for kids, families, and communities, and you can imagine the breadth of issues we deal with, from child welfare to juvenile justice, economic opportunity for low-income families, community-based approaches such as community violence. So there's just a very, very broad array of topics that we take up. And Casey's been on the racial equity, racial justice journey for a few decades now. We have taken a very intentional approach of embedding equity within all of the programmatic and all of the operations of the foundation. So we have an equity and inclusion portfolio. It's probably one of the smallest portfolios in the foundation, very intentionally, because the idea is that all of the grant making in the foundation should represent equity, and there should be equity strategies and investments in Black-led organizations in every corner of the foundation. We have systems in place to track it. We look at what's the investment in organizations of color, in consultants of color, both on a dollar basis as well as on a percentage basis. We don't have targets. I mean, who you're going to work with is really going to depend on what's the work that you're trying to get done. And the intentionality is around what are the strategies that you're trying to move and what's really going to make a difference in breaking down barriers for kids of color in this country. There's certainly moments that make us pause, right? The death of Freddie Gray in our own hometown of Baltimore at the hands of Baltimore police officers was a big moment of pause. And we secured an additional board investment of about $10 million to address that issue, and a lot of those funds went toward youth-led organizations of color. And if you've ever read with youth-led organizations, their first thing was, I don't want your money until I know who you are. And it was a bit of a courtship. But that work has definitely continued. And the death of Ahmaud Arbery and Freddie Gray and Breonna Taylor in close proximity to one another was another moment of pause, where we had to stop and think, what does this mean for us as a foundation? And how does this impact the work that we do? And we really doubled down on the approach to say that, equity isn't an overlay to the work. Equity is the work. And that should be reflected in every grant portfolio in the foundation. I was actually reading some budget documents on a very long flight from Seattle last night, and I had the chance to look at some of who the grantees are. And so when you see the juvenile justice organization investing in homeboy industries, like there's Home on the Horizon, or in Gangsters to Growers, which is a cooperative in Atlanta that's looking at youth entrepreneurship. We're just seeing the whole flavor of investment change. From a broader philanthropy standpoint, a couple of things have been very encouraging. I think you're seeing a lot more foundations leaning much more intentionally into equity. And I base that in part on the number of calls and conversations we've had with people who are newer to the journey, saying, what did that journey look like for Casey? And I'm like, well, it's kind of bumpy. It's not really clean, but there's some intentionality behind it. And you're also seeing corporations who are being very thoughtful about what their response in this moment of equity could be. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But in the conversations that we've been in, they're really trying to figure out, particularly within the equity and inclusion officers, really trying to think about what their approach needs to be beyond a big initiative. What does equity look like internally within the workplace, as well as what are the investments they need to make in the communities where they sort of eat, work, and play, if you will. So those, I think, are both positive trends. We still have a long way to go, but it has been encouraging over the past couple of years to see how more people are leaning in and how the nature of the organizations that are funded is changing.
Well, thank you all. I was going to ask you a second question, but I think you've incorporated a lot of your comments on the second question I was going to ask you. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Tahira. What trends are you seeing across the philanthropic sector? Is this a moment, or is it a movement that will build in momentum?
So I remain optimistic about the shift that we're talking about in philanthropy. There are some really innovative movements that are going on across the country. A few of them actually in California, which really seems to be sort of on this cusp of racial equity and reparations, and even having a conversation at their state government about reparations. There's a movement called the California Freedom Fund, and they are investing $50 million to address and support Black-led organizations in California. Similarly, there's a fund called Ascend BLO, which is also based in California, where they're committing to long-term 10-year investments in Black-led organizations. There's also a new initiative called Abundance, which I know, Ken, your organization is involved in, and that's in California. So really centering the Black experience, really calling out specifically the need for investments in Black organizations. And I think philanthropy is turning this corner, really thinking individually about one foundation's investment in a community, and really thinking about how we can collaborate and co-invest, and what are those opportunities for us to pool our resources together to make sustainable impacts year over year over year. So we understand that in 2020, all of these public commitments were made, and these issues, as we learned and were reminded in sessions earlier today, the issue of racial justice and racial inequity is not going to, quote unquote, fix itself over 2 years. And when you think about all the money that we've just talked about that have been committed, it's really pennies in comparison to the true systemic challenges that are present in our communities. There's also organizations that have been even more explicit in their commitments. There's a foundation here called IF, and they are specific in talking about reparations, and they have a reparations project that they are talking about ways to illuminate Black people's, the way that philanthropy has been exploited from Black labor and Black genius. And they are thinking about the ways that their foundation can invest in Black people in the Washington, D.C. metro area. So really thinking incredibly about how to use their resources and their endowments to specifically support the Black people in their community, and being really explicit about that. It also has a really interesting dynamic on their board, where they are really intentional about making sure that the board members on this foundation are from their communities, and they pay them to be on their boards and to serve in that capacity. So I think, there's a great opportunity that philanthropy is shifting, and you have amazing leaders who are rethinking more outside the box. Ken, I'm going to ask you a question because I know that MacArthur Foundation has been thinking about repair in a new way. And I think that's also a new way that foundations are being intentional about understanding the history of philanthropy, how these foundations have the resources they have in the first place, and what is the next step in thinking about repair in that way. So I actually would love for you to share your journey.
Well, what I will share first and foremost is that recently, about 12 of us from the MacArthur Foundation had gone to Ghana. And there was a racial healing and reparations meeting that took place. And I would say for most of my colleagues, it was probably one of the most emotional experiences that we shared. For folks that have never gone to Ghana, you go to the door of no return, where slaves were taken to this land. But before you even get there, we actually saw the cells where many black folks were housed. And 70% of them did not survive even leaving those cells, let alone coming to either the US, Latin America, or the Caribbean. I say all that to say is that it started back in this particular situation back in March, where there's a group of folks, including Avenel Jones, who wrote the 1619 Project, that talk about the fact, why is there critical race theory to begin with? And the thought was pretty frankly that when you have states that don't want to talk about it because they say it may hurt white people, the question was, but did it hurt black people? I mean, those are the folks that were really adversely impacted by that scenario. So, under the importance of our President John Pelfrey, he's been a great supporter. There's several things we've been involved in. First and foremost, if we go back to even when I think folks mentioned earlier the implications of COVID and racial violence in our country, we were one of a few foundations that actually took out a bond offering, which I led for $125 million. And this is up and beyond the normal grant making. 85% of that grant making went to black or BIPOC black organizations. And you heard colleagues come to my colleagues, but we try to minimize the grant requirements because many of these grassroots organizations may not have the infrastructure of a major organization, but it was about the work. And we felt the work was more important versus whether you have a staff of 20 to 30 people doing that type of work. And the second thing we did, and there's several other foundations that followed, we increased our indirect rate to 29% because they needed infrastructure. I won't mention the organization, but when I used to work at Hopkins, I remember one organization gave me 6%. I'm like, I'm going to do 6%. Quite frankly, that meant I was eating out of my programmatic work so I could support my staff. So I think one of the things we're looking at MacArthur is really being intentional, because we're a global organization as well, to figure out what can be done to ensure that equity is first and foremost. You heard from my colleagues here that we want this work embedded in everything that we do. This cannot be a special project. It has to be a normal way of operating. And to me, that defines success, where you shouldn't talk about it, you should be about it. So that's part of the things that we've been involved in. As an example, when I got my new role in August 1st, I was asked to be the Chief Operating Officer, but I was asked to be the Chief Equity Officer. So I have my colleagues here from MacArthur, but the goal is all 185 of us have to be all in. This is not a black thing. This has to be something that everybody believes in for this to work. And part of that is making sure whether within the confines of our staff, is based on the work, we will track everything, from our investments, to our suppliers, to our hiring practices, everything, because it encapsulates everything of who you are. One example I'll share before I finalize this question is the fact that at the MacArthur building, we actually have artwork on the main floor. And actually had the gentleman from the San Francisco 49ers who kneeled. We actually have a drawing of that. And several things related to Black Lives Matters. I can share with you, there's a tenant who did not like the artwork. And we said, well, if you don't like the artwork, you can leave, because we're not changing it. There have been 2 times we've seen vandalism. We cleaned up the vandalism and we kept it moving because we believe in the work itself. Because once you compromise your values, you lose. So I think we've been very intentional with this, and we've been very candid. I shared recently at a meeting with all the staff at the foundation, I think about 2 weeks ago, that I would have to report every quarter to all of the staff at the MacArthur Foundation to know where we are. If we have oops, they need to know about the oops. If we're successful, they'll need to know about that because you have to be transparent in this work. So we'll be very intentional. But thank you for the question.
And I think that's the key piece to really understanding, and to your question, is this a movement or a moment? And really understanding that the way it becomes a movement is to continue this pipeline. So can your leadership at the foundation, it can't stop. You know what I mean? You can't get to this level and then have no one else come behind you. So I think that the answer to if this is a movement or a moment really requires philanthropy to think about the few steps that we've taken and what is the investment going forward to make sure that we have a next generation of leaders that can be in the C-suite, that can be chief financial officers, CEOs, and I always love to emphasize trustees because a lot of this money and a lot of the importance of the strategic investments and outlooks happen at the boardroom. So really emphasizing the need to take a critical look at our investment as it relates to the pipeline of leaders to really have this be a movement.
You know, I'll make one last comment. I actually joked at MacArthur, I said, and Leslie knows this because we used to work together, I always say I'm overboard. Because I'm on probably more boards that I need to be on, but to your comment, I'm on those boards because they need to have that voice in the room.
Absolutely.
So for example, I'm the chair of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Why is that important? Many times when you have disasters, they hit the underserved communities, right? The thing about New Orleans is a great example. What happens? You have a disaster in New Orleans, you get a little bit of money. Then 10 years later, you have the same disaster, so you haven't resolved the problem. Or I'm the board chair for the Mission Investors Exchange to talk about impact investing, how funds can be used for a bottom line that impacts the communities, more than just the growth of your endowment, but the impact to the work of those communities that you're attempting to serve. So while I have this role, more than me being the CFO now, Chief Operating Officer, but really finding a way, while I do have to see to make sure there's a difference, and also finding people who can follow me once I move on. Because I'm not going to do this work forever. But to your comment, the momentum is more than an individual. No, for free.
So yeah, Ken and I work together. I didn't get to go to Ghana, so I'm salty, and I just want to put that out there. I don't know who's responsible for that. I just want to put it out there. But a couple of things that I thought were super important, and the issue of leadership and representation is huge. Casey's equity work really was begun under Patrick MacArthur, who was a white male social worker who became the president of the Annie Casey Foundation. He championed equity and made it a mandate. Now, we don't have a lot of mandates. If you know Casey, we don't have a lot of mandates. We don't mandate a lot. But he mandated that equity would be part of everything that we did. And the first thing that we did, to Ken's point, was set up metrics, right? If you are what you measure. We were born out of EPS. EPS can track everything. I never lost an EPS package. I don't know about you. FedEx, I can't say the same. But that measurement was incredibly important. So to your point, the staff composition, what's the diversity of staff look like? And not only do we track it internally, but we track it, we require grantees to report it. And we've had grantees who said, we're not going to provide that information. And we said, we're not going to provide funding. It's just a core requirement. And it's really not about targets, it's about really being thoughtful and intentional about what the composition of your workforce is and how that impacts the decisions that are made on behalf of the communities that you work with.
Well, thank you. The next question I have for my colleagues here. What are the most effective approaches you have seen for addressing racial justice within your philanthropic sector? Specifically, from your perspective, what areas of racial justice have you noticed? But more importantly, where has the sector fallen short?
So I'll start just to say that both MacArthur and Annie Casey have been examples for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation because we're much earlier in our journey, and others are who we are learning from. And one of the things, to both Ken and Leslie's point, is trying to change our internal systems so that equity is really baked in at every step of the process. And that has been a lot more difficult than it would seem, just saying words out loud to really readjust all of our systems. Because we're a national foundation and we don't work, with the exception of New Jersey, we don't work in community. we've had to put the onus on some of our grantees and our intermediaries. And when we fund them, we say, okay, you can get this funding, but you have to give 85% of this money, 90% of this money to Black-led organizations. We did that, we did a $90 million investment in community power building. And when we worked with our organization, we set that mandate, and as a result, we had 80% of that $90 million that went to Black female-led organizations. But it only happened because we baked that into the whole process from the beginning. So that's one of the things that has worked a little bit for us. I think we're still, to Tahira's and Ron's point, like philanthropy, we exist because of white supremacy, and that's where our dollars came from. And we're still in the process of reckoning with what that means and how we can go through the process of trying to repair some of those harms through our investments and through our work in the future. And it's a learning curve and a process that we're still on. We're also been playing around with different models of leadership, even within the organization. I shouldn't say playing around, I should say testing, I guess. We're really looking at distributed leadership. Philanthropy as a whole tends to be a very hierarchical system. And we've been intentionally empowering mainly our younger staff who very often have expertise in racial justice and racial reckoning and racial equity, and giving them both the resources and the time to serve alongside positional leaders in doing this work and embedding it in what we're doing. Centering that racial equity in all of our bread and butter activities and the annual budgeting and grant-making process, and really shifting our use of different types of tools, endowments, general operating support, flexible funding grants, have all been tools that we've tried to use to advance our work in racial equity.
So that's a really hard question, what's going well and what isn't. And I think someone said a 2-year yardstick is too short a period of time, and it is, right? We're not going to move over. It took us a whole lot longer than 2 years to get where we are. It's going to take us a whole lot longer than 2 years to move forward. But I think the progress is encouraging. A couple of things that I see philanthropy doing more that are very positive. One is centering community and people who are impacted in decision making, right? Solutions should come from those who have been affected and who we're trying to work on behalf of, as opposed to we know what's best for you, which is I'm going to call it the benefactor approach to community engagement. And so we're going to give you the things that you need. It's really about how do you sit down with community and understand what the needs are, what the investment should be, and more importantly, what the solutions are. And at the Casey Foundation, we have dedicated more than at least 50% of our grant making to youth and young adults between the ages of 14 and 24, because there's so much developmental growth that happens during that time period, and because there's so little investment that happens during that time period. We all agree that birth to 5 is a critical time for children and their development, but we forget that it's not game over at 6, right? At 14, there's a lot that's happening in adolescence. There's a huge amount of research that shows how the brain is developing, and so we've leaned in on that. And the reason I mention that is centering young people. If you've never had a party, center young people in decision making and try to co-create with them, because this generation has some points of view, and they're not shy about it, and they don't hold back, and they're very adamant in all the ways that they should be. And I think that's another really positive trend, which is if you look at any movement that has taken place and been effective, there may have been grown-ups in the room, but the young people are really on the front line, and investing in youth advocacy, investing in youth-led organizations, investing in young people is a hugely important thing. Ken talked a little bit about healing on that Ghana trip that I wasn't invited to, but that's okay. And I think the notion of healing, and you see I'm really not over it, is something we should be talking more about, particularly as a Black community. We know that we've had generations of oppression, right? We know that trauma is real, and we know that trauma has to be healed, and we know that you carry that trauma from generation to generation to generation, and we know now that it not only affects your psyche, it affects your physiology. You are more likely to get certain illnesses if you grow up under that trauma. And so I think when we talk about the Black community and we talk about philanthropic investments, we have to talk about well-being. We have to talk about addressing trauma, and we have to talk about healing. And the way that I've seen it most effective is, once again, when it's built into the work. If we're doing work in the child welfare system, the trauma-informed practice, because God knows there's a lot of trauma that happens within that system and to young people in it, that should be a part of it, right? What's the role of employers and workforce as it relates to understanding the trauma that young people of color have experienced, and how do you bring in principles of adolescent youth development into the workplace, and what does that investment look like? You know, things like social capital. You know, we have long been kept out of institutions, right, where that social capital, the mentors, forget about the mentors, it's about the sponsors, the corporate sponsors. And so how do we start to invest in those things? So it's really, how do you build in the notion of healing, and particularly with young people, of well-being in all the ways that they define well-being. So yes, I need to know that you graduated from high school on time, and that you got a post-secondary credential, and that you got and kept the job. But I also need to know that you're paying attention to your well-being and the way you see well-being. And I think philanthropy really leaning into those concepts and investing in it as a core part of all the work that they're doing is a critically important piece. And then I have one more thing, and then I'll shut up. And that's around, and this is relevant to the Joint Center. They've done a brilliant job as they stood up the Workforce Center and bringing the voices of Black workers into the conversation in circles where it might not otherwise have been present. We passed some incredible legislation recently, both the infrastructure bill, which I'm going to forget the name of it, but somebody will remind me, and also the Safer Communities Act. Passing the legislation is the easy part, believe it or not. It's the implementation of that legislation and making sure that at the state level, that money is actually getting to our communities in the way that it was intended to make sure that the jobs are actually happening in communities of color. And so the investment of philanthropy in the implementation of these huge pieces of legislation that it moved is an area that I think we need to see more of, and we've just not seen enough.
I would just love to add, I think historically philanthropy has contributed to the volatility of BIPOC, people of color-led organizations, because of the way in which we do our grant-making cycles and our commitment to funding being on a yearly basis. And to the points that have been brought up here, often in times of crisis, there are surges of funding that then get eliminated and leaving these organizations to sort of crumble under the weight and the pressure of what that retractive system looks like. So I think philanthropy has become a lot more aware, I think, like as a whole, that we historically have done a lot of harm in this space. And I think collectively are trying to do better in terms of stabilizing these organizations so that there can be a voice at the table and that representation is present and being led when it comes to solutions.
Before we go further, let's see Tahira as a perspective. And the reason why I'm going to ask you, because I was fortunate to be the board chair, I guess about 3 years ago. It's really looking at philanthropy in terms of what they're doing. So from a macro level, what perspective would you have on that question?
I always think it's so interesting that foundations find it so difficult to fund Black organizations. And I always challenge philanthropy to think about, what if you don't fund them? So what happens? So what's the goal here? So it's more challenging for Black-led nonprofits to get money. So what? Like what is the desire? What is your intention? So I'm inspired by these conversations with my colleagues today. And I guess my message to philanthropy, and I agree, I do think philanthropy is shifting, and they're starting to get out of the way, and really centering community, and really centering differing voices and differing leaders. But I guess my hope is that philanthropy begins to fund Black people because they want us to win. Like it's not the pennies. It's the true investment so that we can actually get to a place of equity. organizations that get the investments are, the ones that are, supporting community or supporting others. We're really thinking about the full perspective and full breadth of the Black experience. So we know that even as we look through the Black organizations that get funding, it's not typically the arts. It's not typically, the things that bring Black people joy and bring us hope and peace. It's really more of the crisis in order just to feed families and get families into housing, but really thinking about how do we fund the full experience, the fullness of our people, and how do we invest in that like we want us to win.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, I'll provide a comment. It was about a year ago I did a presentation, and I said, what does the word philanthropy mean? It means the love of mankind. That's what it means, right? But more importantly, it says philanthropy has a unique opportunity that we can take risk that corporations cannot do because they may have earnings per share calculations, stock quotas, and the like. So I think philanthropy is unique in that aspect, that we should be doing things that other segments of society aren't able to do. So that's the backdrop. Some in philanthropy may feel as though their foundations are not sufficiently ambitious in their racial equity goals, or is not following through with racial equity commitments. Do you believe that support exists within your boards, within your organization, within your leadership? If not, what can change the paradigm and what's possible? Do you have any thoughts on strategies these allies of Black communities might use within their own foundations to motivate co-workers to make more progress?
Well, I have to go first. I guess it's my turn. I was joking with Ken before I came in here. I said, when you're doing work in equity, if you're at a place where half the world says you're not doing enough and half the world says you're doing too much, you're probably in about the right place. And I feel like every day I wake up and half the world is saying, you're just going way too far, and the other half is like, you haven't gone nearly far enough. And I'm like, okay, I'm still good, right? Because everybody's got a different perspective on how to lean in on equity in this moment. And I think we have to kind of remind ourselves that it is a long game, right? And that equity is a strategy. And how you move and when you move and how you talk about when you move and what you resource, all of that's incredibly important. If number one, we're gonna stay in the game, and number two, we're gonna win the game. And I don't know about you guys, but I fully intend for our communities to prosper and to thrive. And I know that if my goal is for all kids to be better off, and I know that white kids are here and Black kids are here, unless I close that gap, all kids are not gonna be better off. So I'm backed by data and evidence that this is the path I need to go on, and I'm moving in that direction. I think, we are very well supported by the organization, certainly by the leadership. Everybody, if you ask my staff, everybody's got a different point of view on equity within KC, and some days we're doing great and some days we aren't. And you just accept that as it is. One of the things I would say that I've learned about, two things that I've learned. One is rooting equity in the values of the organization is incredibly important. Because at the end of the day, a foundation, it is an institution, right? And it has institutional values, and it does have a board. It probably has a founder who has some values, and all of that matters. And the ability to advance equity in a way that's consistent with those values, and to go back and say, one of the things that we value is inclusiveness. So one of the things that we value is the well-being of kids, and to say the reason that we have to do this work is because that's anchored in our values. That's incredibly, really, really important. And the other thing is the notion of meeting people where they are, right? We didn't all walk into this room in the same place. Our journey, our perspectives, our mental models are not all the same. And on the equity journey, I particularly remember early on in the foundation's work, it was a little frustrating because there were some folks who were like, you don't know about this, right? And we were like, well, we know about it, and we're going to move forward with it. But really meeting people where they are, understanding what are their mental models, understanding what is it going to take them to move along. And some folks are going to decide that they're not going to move along, and that's okay too, right? meeting people where they are and bringing them along from the, from the front desk worker to the chairman of the board is critically important. We spend a lot of time, in fact, I was just in Seattle presenting to our board on the topic of equity. And we talked about research that had been done by the Brookings Institution looking at 3 generations of poverty for black families versus white families. And I'll give you the punchline. The punchline is that 1% of people, of white families, have experienced poverty for 3 generations. Your grandparents, your parents, and now you are living in poverty. 20% of black families experience 3 generations of poverty. So the data and the research is very compelling. And we're very thoughtful about how do we really educate our board and bring them along in how to think about this journey and why we're doing this work and why it's important and why we can't just say, well, this is a post-racial America, right? And we've made progress and we're there. And we always go back to, because the data says that we're not there. In fact, the data says that we're not even close. And we have to continue to do this work and we have to continue to lean in. So I would say the values of the organization, I would say meet people where they are. We talked about you are what you measure. So the measurements you put in place are critically important. And then just continue to follow the data. The data is very compelling. We can't always agree. Actually, in this study, they could agree on the data. They couldn't actually agree on the root causes of the solutions. That's okay. If we can at least agree on the data, that's a starting point. So that's the perspective that I would give to anybody who's trying to figure out how to move this work forward.
I don't know that I can add on that. That was so eloquently said. And one of the things that we're learning at RWJF from Casey and others, I just want to hone in a little bit more on that, on the board piece. I feel like that's critically important. Is not only teaching our boards, many of which are not very diverse in their own representation, but teaching them about the history of racism, but also the contemporary manifestations of systemic racism, and bringing those examples to life through things like board site visits is a real practical way to try to bring the board and staff along through the learning journey and through embedding it into all of the work that's happening. I think also just sharing examples of Black-led organizations and the work that they're doing, from sort of the basic needs work to some of the larger structural legislative systems change work that Black-led organizations are doing. Sharing that with board members and with staff regularly, I think, is another great tool. And I think just encouraging these alliances and collaborations, the multi-stakeholder collaborations, not just across philanthropy, but with many of our other partners, our grantees, and in some instances with corporate sponsors as well, and figuring out how those partnerships can work in aligned ways to advance this cause, I think, has been some ways that we can help push it forward.
So one of the things that we've heard from our members, many of whom are Black professionals in philanthropy, is the conversations happening at some foundations around the window closing. So there were commitments that were made in 2020, and now there's been an organizational shift, or whatever the terminology these foundations are using to say, well, now we're focusing on something else. So, the things that we talked about, the resources that we had previously allocated are now going to other things. And so, AbbVie has been really committed to supporting Black CEOs, Black Foundation CEOs specifically, and thinking about how we support Black folks in philanthropy to continue the effort. And it's hard, particularly when you are the only one or one of very few in your foundation. And so that's really a space that AbbVie is really thinking about how we can be intentional. We will begin convening Black corporate foundation professionals next year, really thinking about those corporate statements that were made following the murder of George Floyd, really understanding how do you create a change management, how do you support your CEO and others to really commit to those public announcements, and how do you create those connections to Black communities so that those investments happen over the long term. There's also a piece here around Black community funds. So a lot of our community foundations have community funds. And so how are we able to support Black philanthropy and really understanding that, philanthropy and active philanthropy is something that Black communities have done for generations. We just don't call it that. And so how can we be even more intentional about the ways that we give, the ways that we've given historically, and really thinking about, there may not always be a space that we have to create at someone else's table. Maybe we can create our own. What does that look like for us as we go forward?
Thank you. The last question I have, and I think many of you may have responded to this in your earlier comments. How do you foresee philanthropy's approach to supporting racial justice evolving? And maybe I'll start by saying, if we look at racial justice in our country, we know it's disproportionate for folks of color, particularly African Americans. So I was thinking recently about Joe Biden making the announcement about decriminalizing marijuana. And we know that African Americans disproportionately have criminal records for marijuana. And if you are able to handle that situation, that frees up a lot of people for work opportunities, as a great example, depending on what state you're from. But the other part would be, now that in many states you are decriminalizing it, are you allowing Black businesses to be part of that equation? And we're not seeing that that's a billion-dollar industry that we're recognizing. So are you being equitable on the flip side if you believe that's something that's appropriate to ensure that folks have equitable opportunities? So I thought that as an example in terms of racial justice, more than about folks being incarcerated, but also ensuring that there's justice across the map in terms of everything that you see in terms of opportunity moments. So with that as a backdrop, I'll be curious to hear from my colleagues on anything, because what's unique about our panel, they can bring it from different perspectives based on the nature of their foundation.
I'll jump in. So, I think we can look at history, right? And we know that when there are moments, or not moments, periods of time when there's a lot of progressive movement for Black communities, that is immediately followed by backlash, right? So we are in this period where we are going to transition into a very intentional backlash period. And some might even say we're already in it. And I do fear from the philanthropic perspective, we should very much be more risk averse than we are as a sector. But philanthropy is not is very risk averse. I'll just put it that way. And as racial equity work becomes more and more politicized, I do fear that the risk equation will change, and the commitment to racial equity will therefore subsequently change for philanthropy and the impacts that that's going to have. In the policy realm, we're not only just seeing the political backlash, but also aggressive, highly coordinated, well-resourced legal attacks on the ability to undertake race-conscious policy making. And as several of partners have already emphasized, there's going to be a need for a comprehensive legal and narrative strategy to fend off these current legal threats and to shape the legal doctrine over the long term in a way that recognizes the importance of racial equity to a healthy multiracial democracy. All of that is under attack right now, and I fear that we're in a position of defense already, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that was very, very well said. And I don't have my mic on, but I'm loud, so it's okay. We think about the backlash all the time, right? And yes, there's a racial reckoning moment, but there are also multiple conservative movements that are happening simultaneously. So there's a lot that's happening in this country right now, and there's a lot of, there's pressure on all sides, and how intentionally and persistently we move around equity in the face We need to be a lot more responsive. We need to pay a lot more attention. We're going to be called to pay a lot more attention to sort of the externalities that are happening in the environment, to Avenel's point. How do we anticipate them? You know, it would be nice for a change to get ahead of them, as opposed to always reacting to them. I feel like we're always reacting. And that's a big piece of the work going forward. I think, I think if I think about young people, what we hear from young people is we're not one-dimensional. You know, I am both Black and bisexual and an immigrant, and so thinking about equity within the concept of the whole person is something that I find that young people are demanding of us, and philanthropy needs to spend some time really thinking about that, right? And what does that look like? And how do we sort of invest in a way that can incorporate that type of thinking? I think, Ken talked about social investments. I think we've scratched the surface of what we can do with social investments. Casey's done some work in inclusive entrepreneurship. We've invested in CDFIs that are making capital available in places like the Mississippi Delta. That's a conversation over tea and beverages, right? So supporting, Black home ownership, job creation, supporting the child care industry. Right? And if you think about how the way the child care industry works, so it's been decimated, but the majority of child care is provided by these large institutions, and child care providers of color are generally small, home-based family businesses. So if we're going to support child care, we need to support it in a way that supports these Black-run child care centers as well. So really thinking about how do we leverage social investments in a time where I think policy is going to be extraordinarily challenging for us to take on, in part because it's hard to move anything, right? And in part because politics and race have been so conflated with one another very intentionally that it's making it increasingly difficult, to Avenel's point, to move, forget about, race-based policy. We lost that fight a long time ago. Race-conscious policy, right? If I know that 20% of Black, 20% of people who live in poverty over 3 generations are Black, I should be able to do something about that, right? And there are some ways I can address it. It's getting increasingly difficult to move that way. So we have to think about what are the levers that we have left. And the last thing I'll say is there's an increasing amount of research on the issue of polarization and bridging as an antidote to polarization. And so those of you who know the work of John Powell at the House Institute, so for like 30 years, John Powell has been talking about bridging, right? And the notion of belonging. And so now all of a sudden, bridging is this thing, and people forget, that actually John Powell is the godfather of bridging, right? But I think philanthropy really needs to lean in on the concept of bridging, on how do we get back to what used to be common sense consensus. We can't get to any kind of consensus, and there's not a whole lot of common sense happening out there. We have to find ways to sort of dial things down a bit, to bring the temperature down so that we can start to have those conversations, because talking amongst ourselves, among people who think like we do and who have the same mental models we do, isn't going to get us there. We have to sit and have hard conversations with people who are in very different places, who have very different mental models, and really influence the way that they think in order to move this game forward. So I think really thinking about the role of foundation in depolarization and really advancing principles of bridging, which is really our work, is going to be another important place for philanthropy.
Great. I'll close with Kenneth.
I was just going to say I appreciate this perspective. It's something that we've been talking about at Avenel, which is really, this attack on anti-Black racism and really how that's playing out, and particularly how it's playing out with Black-led nonprofits that have become even more secluded and fearful of putting information out, which makes it harder for them to get grants. So it's this cycle of, when you take 2 steps, sometimes the attacks are real. And so how do we support the continued progress? But yeah, that's absolutely happening. Even when you think about things like CRT, where things can just become so politicized in a way where, you don't look up the terminology, you forget what it actually is, and you actually think that that's what the challenge is. So I'm grateful for my colleagues here to really address that. One of the things that we've talked about at Avenel here, when we're partnering with Kenneth on some work, because many Black-led organizations don't put information in Kenneth because they are fearful of who gets that information. One of the interesting things that I'll share is that one of, I'm sure most of you know the NAACP, what we have found is that the bigger the Black organization is, the less they mention that they focus on Black people. And so even understanding that there is a fear, no matter how big your budget is, to talk about the community that you want to support. We just did some research that you go to the NAACP's website, they don't say anything about Blackness at all. And so really thinking about what does that mean? How do we talk about our work? And how are we preparing our communities and our organizations to be able to embrace these attacks, embrace this polarized social dialogue that we're in.
As we close, I want to give you 3 take-home messages. First, this work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So recognize for my colleagues that it will evolve over time. I wish I could tell you in 2 years we will be there, but I would be less than honest with that, so it's a marathon. Second, leadership matters. If you have the right leadership in your organization, within your boards, your ability to move things forward will happen much faster versus leadership which are wishy-washiness. And thirdly, one of the things I've enjoyed recently is seeing how philanthropy is working together. When I first got into philanthropy 14 years ago, everyone had their way of doing it. You're finding us collaborating with each other, and I think that's been particularly critical. So with that, we really truly appreciate the time and contribution of our panelists, so I'd like to give applause to my panelists. We welcome you to check the Joint Center website for more information and updates. Also, we invite you to return to the main assembly room for the afternoon reception. Again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate this conversation. Hopefully, folks had questions that we were able to answer, so thank you again.